This Shabbat is our annual Saxe Scholar in Residence program established by George and Dorothy Saxe. George, along with Dorothy, was a founding member of this congregation. George was also a past president of Beth Am, a veteran of World War II, a beloved husband, father, and grandfather, a successful businessman, and a passionate philanthropist who was a leader in both the Jewish and the arts communities. We remember George on this Shabbat, and we also honor Dorothy and the rest of their family. Sadly, Dorothy has a bit of a cold tonight and is unable to be with us, but I'm hoping you're watching, Dorothy, and I want to thank you for your friendship and for all that you've done for Congregation Beth Am, including the establishment of this annual Scholar in Residence program so that we might have the opportunity to learn from outstanding Jewish teachers. And on this Shabbat, our teacher is Dr. Judith Rosenbaum. Dr. Rosenbaum is CEO of the Jewish Women's Archive, a pioneering digital archive that documents Jewish women's stories, elevates their voices, and inspires them to be agents of change. An educator, historian, and writer, Judith earned a PhD in American Studies from Brown University with a focus on women, gender, and social movements. A former Fulbright Fellow, she teaches and lectures widely on Jewish studies and women's studies, and publishes in both academic and popular journals and anthologies. She serves on the faculty of the Bronfman Fellowship and is a Schusterman Senior Fellow. Judith lives with her family in the Boston area and is a close friend of our families. It's wonderful to have you here. And the title of Dr. Rosenbaum's talk tonight is Women, History, and Memory, Celebrating and Reconsidering Firsts. It's a pleasure, Judith, to invite you to our bima.
Shabbat Shalom. It is wonderful to be here with all of you, and I'm really honored to be the Saxe Scholar in Residence this weekend. I look forward to learning with all of you. So, in the Jewish historical calendar, 2022 has been a year of milestones. The 100th anniversary of the first bat mitzvah in America, and the 50th anniversary of the ordination of the first woman rabbi in America. I'm a historian, so I like to look back to inflection points like these so that we can make sense of how change happens. I also like to complicate the narratives we've received. So I look at anniversaries not just as moments to be celebrated, but also as milestones to be interrogated. One of the important insights that anniversaries can raise is, how do we actually date a particular innovation? In other words, where does change begin? Who gets recognized as the first, and how do we perceive what came before her that may have helped set the stage? Let's take the anniversary of women in the rabbinate, a development that I know this congregation has benefited from. The 50th anniversary dates to the ordination of Rabbi Sally Priesand in June of 1972, which made her the first American woman rabbi and the first woman rabbi ordained by a seminary. We also know, however, that since at least 1890, the question of whether and when women could be rabbis has come up repeatedly in every decade. While this in part, of course, reflects the rising expectations of women's involvement in public life and access to education and professions, we can also assume that the question wasn't born in the 19th century, but preceded it. We know that women served in educational leadership in earlier times, women such as Osnat Barzani, who led a yeshiva in 17th century Kurdistan. Though she may not fit our modern definition of a rabbi, since she was not officially ordained, she held a role that was actually more selective and significant, a Rosh Yeshiva who trained other rabbis. So, is she actually the first? What can we learn from the women before 1972, whom we might call proto-rabbis? Osnat Barzani was, above all else, a scholar. She was trained by her father, the head of the yeshiva in Mosul, and when she married, it was under the condition that she would be allowed to continue studying. Ultimately, she ended up teaching the students of the yeshiva in place of her husband, and then officially taking over when her husband died. Despite not being formally ordained, she clearly held authority among men. Her life reminds us to challenge the assumptions that we might hold about the necessary institutional pathways to authority. Ray Frank, who came from San Francisco, was the first woman to preach from a pulpit in the U.S. When she arrived in Spokane, Washington in 1890, just before Rosh Hashanah, and discovered that there were to be no high holiday services because the community was too divided, she took it upon herself to organize and to preach. Hundreds turned out to witness the spectacle of a woman preacher, and they were so impressed by Frank that she was invited to stay and preach again on Yom Kippur. She became an instant sensation, touring for years around the U.S. as a popular speaker on Jewish subjects, often under the headline, "The Girl Rabbi of the Golden West." Interestingly, Frank claimed to have no interest in becoming a rabbi, but her mere presence on the bima sparked significant consideration of the question of women in the rabbinate. And as a speaker, she promoted the spiritual importance of Jewish women and the need for greater opportunities for their religious leadership. From her model, we learn that these proto-rabbis were passionate doers and problem solvers. Paula Ackerman was a Rebbitzin in Meridian, Mississippi. When her husband, the rabbi, died unexpectedly in 1950, the congregation asked her to fill in, and she conducted weddings and funerals, led services, and gave sermons for 3 years until a man could be found to replace her. From Ackerman, we learn these women were resourceful and dependable public servants who, despite their unconventional roles, brought comfort and security to their communities during difficult times. Her story might also prompt us to notice the delicate dance of humility and self-advocacy that these pioneering leaders engaged in, to be seen as capable of holding authority without necessarily commanding it. Then there were the women who studied for the rabbinate but were never ordained. And I'll give you some of their names just because I think it's important to have some familiarity with them, to hear them, to bring them into the room. Martha Newmark and Irma Levy Lindheim in the early 1920s, Helen Leventhal Lyons in the 1930s. Their persistence forced the reform movement to acknowledge that women could, in theory, become rabbis, though they did not get to reap the rewards of their own perseverance. This was almost the case for Regina Jonas, who ultimately became the first woman known to be ordained as a rabbi in 1935 in Berlin. Born in 1902 to an Orthodox family of modest means, Regina felt called to be a rabbi from early childhood, though no one, of course, had ever intimated that such a role was possible for a girl. She began studying for ordination in the early 1920s at the Institute for the Study of Judaism, which was Germany's liberal rabbinic seminary, and she completed her final thesis in 1930 on the subject, "May a Woman Hold Rabbinic Office?" It was the first attempt that we know of to use halakha, Jewish law, to argue for women's ordination. But tragically, her advisor, Edward Baneth, died just before he could ordain her, and his successor refused to fulfill the controversial commitment, and so she graduated with a teaching degree, not a rabbinic one. For the next 5 years, she taught religious studies in both Jewish and public schools until finally, in 1935, Rabbi Max Dieneman agreed to ordain her. Initially, even with her new title, Jonas was unable to obtain a pulpit position, and so she continued to teach and lecture. When the Nazis banned Jewish education in schools, she created a small underground school for girls in her own apartment. But here's where history gets a little weird. The increasing Nazi threat, which ultimately killed her, at first created new opportunities for this woman rabbi. As more and more male rabbis emigrated or were imprisoned, Jonas's leadership was suddenly needed and therefore welcome. It turns out gender conventions are more flexible when the whole world has turned upside down. So Jonas began to serve as a rabbi in Berlin and in the surrounding smaller communities. Even when she and her mother were forced out of their apartment and she was assigned to forced labor at a factory, she continued to lead prayer services in the evening. In 1942, Regina and her mother were deported to Theresienstadt, where she served as a rabbi for 2 years, preaching, teaching, and counseling, until she was deported to Auschwitz, where she was murdered in October of 1944. And then she was seemingly forgotten, despite the fact that people who knew her survived, including prominent leaders like the rabbi and scholar Leo Baeck and the psychiatrist Viktor Frankl. Her story was rediscovered only after the Berlin Wall came down, and her papers, which she had presciently placed in the archive of the German Jewish community before her deportation, were unearthed in East Germany in 1991. Now, I say seemingly forgotten because it's very hard to imagine that those who knew her actually forgot about her, right? Her story was really quite extraordinary. Rather, her story was not one that they chose to tell. Why are some stories passed on and others are left out? Why was Regina Jonas's story so hard to tell? This narrative of a visionary young woman who pursued a very unusual path in a time of crisis didn't quite fit into the horrific story of hatred and extermination, nor did it fit the recognizable outlines of resistance, though I would argue that her persistence and leadership make her a model of a kind of cultural resistance. She's obscured in a shadowy time that doesn't match the narrative of mainstream progress that's usually associated with the emergence of women rabbis. But without her story, those other rabbinic pioneers, women like Sally Priesand and the first women rabbis of the other denominations, Sandy Eisenberg Sasso, Amy Alberg, and Sarah Hurwitz, they didn't have access to the insights of Regina Jonas and the model of how a woman rabbi could work within Jewish law. With knowledge of Jonas, they could have been seen and seen themselves as carrying on a proud legacy, rather than exceptional figures breaking new ground. There is pride, of course, in being a first, but it can also be a distraction or even marginalizing. The designation of first calls out difference, not belonging. Take the term exceptional. The implication is special, unique, but not normative. When someone seeking inclusion is perceived as an exception, even if they succeed in gaining entry for themselves, their presence as a special case is unlikely to lead to broad and lasting change. Jonas expressed this herself, writing in 1939, "For me, it was never about being the first. I wish I had been the 100,000th. In other words, it would have been more meaningful to her to be part of a collective of rabbis, an accepted community of women leaders, than to be marked as a pioneer or as a troublemaker." The first American woman rabbi, Sally Priesand, expressed something similar. Priesand, like Jonas, discovered her calling as a young person. From her early teen years, she knew that she wanted to be a rabbi, again, despite the fact that no one had ever suggested that this was a possibility. Rabbi Priesand told us at the Jewish Women's Archive, "When I decided to study for the rabbinate, I never thought much about being a pioneer, nor was it my intention to champion the rights of women. I just wanted to be a rabbi." But by the time she entered rabbinical school in 1968, the second wave of the women's movement was building momentum, and she was treated as a rabble-rouser, even if that was not her intention or her style. Synagogues refused to hire her for internships, claiming it would be too disruptive to have a woman in the role. Much like Regina Jonas before her, Priesand wrote her rabbinical thesis on the subject of women in Judaism, exploring the changing role of women in Jewish history and what it meant for women to take on public religious leadership. Also like Jonas, Priesand's ordination was championed by an individual male rabbi, in her case Nelson Gluck, who was the president of HUC-JIR when she arrived on campus, and he too died before he could ordain her. Thankfully for Priesand, his successor, Alfred Gottschalk, fulfilled the promise of her ordination, and on June 3, 1972, Priesand broke the stained glass ceiling and became a rabbi. Her perseverance and her humble leadership won over her classmates, who stood in her honor when she ascended the bima to be ordained. Firsts are only legible as such if they are followed by something else. And of course, it's what follows the first that actually leads to further change. We see this in the case of bat mitzvah. The first bat mitzvah was Judith Kaplan in March of 1922. But it wasn't her idea. It was the innovation of her father, Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, who went on to be the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism. At the time, just a few months before his daughter's bat mitzvah, he had started his own synagogue, the Society for the Advancement of Judaism, now just known as SAJ. And among the innovations he had in mind for his congregation was bat mitzvah. Women's emancipation was in the air. It was just 2 years after the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And Kaplan wanted SAJ to be responsive to the times. As the father of 4 daughters, he also had a particular stake in modernizing Judaism in this way. And he later described Judith as, quote, the first of 4 reasons for inaugurating bat mitzvah. The other 3 reasons, of course, being his daughters Hadassah, Naomi, and Selma. Now, as radical as this first bat mitzvah was for its time, it was limited in several ways. Judith didn't read from the Torah scroll, but from a chumash, from a printed book. She didn't ascend the bima, but stood below it. And perhaps most importantly, the bat mitzvah didn't mark the start of ongoing ritual participation for her or any other woman in the congregation. It was the celebration of a moment, not the beginning of a new role for her as a young adult in the community. Those changes took much longer, and those were often initiated by girls themselves. Girls were the first to ask the questions that helped propel bat mitzvah into a revolutionary movement. They asked, like some teen girls at SAJ did in 1945, so this is more than 20 years after Judith Kaplan's bat mitzvah, why were they being taught how to chant the blessings and their Torah portions if they were only going to be allowed to do it once in their lives? Why couldn't they, like the boys, continue to participate in Shabbat services in this way after their bat mitzvah? They asked, like future Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan did in 1973, why her Orthodox synagogue in New York hadn't yet found a way to celebrate a bat mitzvah. Now, they did partially accommodate her request, not with a Shabbat morning service, as she had wanted, but with a Friday night service. And her rabbi, Shlomo Riskin, recalled later that, and this is a quote, after that we did bat mitzvahs all the time. She was part of my education. This was a watershed moment. Of course, he's widely credited with inventing the Orthodox bat mitzvah, and I think that credit should go to Justice Kagan. As we know, making room for questions and innovative responses is generative, allowing further questions and further innovation. When bat mitzvah called attention to the ways girls and women were excluded from full participation in Jewish life, it also prompted many to notice who else was left out or didn't have access. How do we include people of different abilities? How do we ensure that families of all kinds are treated with respect? How do we include Jews by choice? How do we mark the coming of age of non-binary kids? The mainstream acceptance of bat mitzvah has solidified the belief that every Jew should have access to a coming of age ceremony, no matter their identity or ability. It's become an essential Jewish life cycle event. And this has sparked new creativity and an expansion of our communities. And thus, the revolution that began with bat mitzvah continues to unfold. Now, there's no magic significance to any number, not 100, not 50. But I believe that these anniversaries are worth noting on the most basic level, because if we forget them, we lose sight of the fact that change actually happens. When I teach teens, almost none of them know that bat mitzvah is only 100 years old, or that women have only been ordained by seminaries for 50 years. Many of them have grown up seeing women lead in their own synagogues, and they assume that it's been a birthright for Jewish girls forever. And there's something beautiful about that. It can be tempting to want to forget the stories that speak of exclusion and inequality. We don't necessarily want to articulate that as part of our heritage. But if we forget that change happened, we lose the opportunity to learn how it happened and to learn from that. And we need to know how change happens, both the successes and the obstacles, so we can continue to make change in the world. If we forget that change happened, we also lose sight of the fact that change is always happening, that our traditions, no matter how traditional they may seem, are constantly evolving. I'm sure you've witnessed that here at Beth Am. Every innovation carries forward the legacy of the pioneers, whether we know their stories or not. And they challenged the ways that they challenged the status quo and took ownership of Judaism. In this week's Torah portion, Jacob dreams of a ladder connecting the spot on which he sleeps to the heavens, a sort of gateway for angels. When he awakes, he exclaims, "Surely Adonai is present in this place, and I did not know it." Like Jacob, we are part of a chain, whether we know it or not. That moment helped Jacob connect to the God of his ancestors and to see himself as part of God's people. So too, I hope that we can learn to see the chain of history and innovation as both sacred and accessible to us. I also want to give us permission to dream ourselves, and here I'll call on a teaching of Rabbi Sarah Hurwitz, the first Orthodox woman ordained a rabbi in the U.S. In 2014, she spoke as part of a historic trip that brought rabbinic pioneers and other Jewish communal leaders to Berlin and Prague in the footsteps of Regina Jonas to learn more about Jonas and to commemorate a plaque in her memory at Theresen. Rabbi Hurwitz grew up in an Orthodox community, and though she was drawn to building and serving Jewish communities, it was inconceivable that she would become a rabbi. But after years of studying and working at an Orthodox congregation as an intern, she was ordained in 2009. Rabbi Hurwitz concluded her remarks at the program on Regina Jonas by noting the importance of dreaming big. She said, "During Birkat HaKohanim, the blessing of the priests, there is a custom to read the refrain, Chalom chalamti ve'eni yodea mahu. I dreamt a dream, but I do not know what it means." She compared her dream of Orthodox women serving as clergy to those ineffable dreams. We must give voice to those dreams, even if they are almost beyond words, even if we don't know yet what they mean. We will make them legible by remembering those dreamers who come before us, like Jacob, like Regina Jonas, and by those who are yet to come. In biblical tradition, remembering is very powerful. When God remembers, something always happens. We see it in this week's Torah portion. When God remembers Rachel, she gives birth to Joseph, who ultimately saves his brothers and enables the generations of Israelites who come from them. Tonight, I invite you to see engagement in history as part of that divine strategy of remembering as an act of agency. A new genealogy, one that includes our own stories and our own dreams, awaits. Shabbat Shalom.